The Hürtgen Forest was a natural trap carved over centuries along the mountainous edge between Belgium and Germany. South of Aachen, within a triangle formed by Aachen, Düren and Monschau, stretched some 50 square miles of fir-covered hills, deep valleys and fast-flowing streams. It was the threshold of the Eifel, a harsh territory where roads twisted between steep slopes and ravines in permanent shadow. In that autumn of 1944, the front line clung to that dark mass of woodland which American soldiers would soon dub the Green Hell. The terrain of the Hürtgenwald followed a pattern that favoured those who knew how to wait on the defensive. Two ridgelines crossed the forest from southwest to northeast, pointing toward the Rur River. Along the northern ridge lay the villages of Hürtgen, Kleinhau and Grosshau, small clusters of houses and farms dominating isolated clearings within the forest mass. On the southern ridge, another chain of hills linked Lammersdorf with the remote village of Schmidt, then almost unknown even to many Germans. Between the two lines opened the gorge of the Rhine River, a narrow, fast-flowing course hemmed in by tree-covered walls that turned any movement into an exhausting effort. The Germans had exploited this natural setting to reinforce the western border of the Reich. Before the war, the regime had erected the concrete wall known as the West Wall, or Siegfried Line, a chain of fortifications that in the Hürtgen area penetrated deep into the heart of the forest. Among the trees lay hidden concrete bunkers, casemates several meters thick, machine gun nests with interlocking fields of fire, and shelters dug into the slopes. In front of them, in clearings and access routes, stood rows of dragon's teeth, concrete blocks designed to block armoured vehicles and lines of steel posts driven into the ground to stop traffic. Added to this defensive network were the mines. Main approaches, forest paths and likely assembly points were sown with devices of every kind: anti-tank mines, low metal content anti-personnel mines impossible to detect with Allied equipment, and the dreaded bounding mines that exploded at waist height, filling the air with shrapnel. In practice, every leaf-covered ditch could conceal a detonator, and every uncertain step could end in mutilation or death. The combination of dense forest, limited visibility, and minefields turned any advance into a blind march. Facing this scenario, the Allied forces approaching from the west were organized around the U.S. First Army, commanded by General Courtney Hodges. Its main instrument in the area was the 7th Corps, led by Lightning Joe Collins, an aggressive commander who had fought in the Pacific and believed that Germany was on the verge of collapse. Under his authority stood several veteran infantry divisions, such as the 1st, 4th, 9th and 28th, along with armoured divisions that had raced across France at high speed. To Allied staffs, these names represented seasoned formations, capable of breaking defences and exploiting any breach. However, in the forest, those strengths dissolved. Tanks could scarcely manoeuvre along the narrow roads. Blowing a bridge or blocking a crossroads was enough to immobilize them. Artillery formations, so effective in open terrain, had enormous difficulty adjusting fire among tall trees which detonated shells prematurely and turned the treetops into a ceiling of lethal splinters. Tactical aviation, which had been the terror of German columns in France, found few visible targets amid the tangle of trunks and the careful camouflage of the defenders. Thus, the First Army was forced to rely above all on its foot infantry. On the German side, responsibility for defending the Hürtgen sector fell to the 7th Army, subordinate to von Rundstedt's command on the Western Front. The divisions assigned to the forest were not the elite units the Allies had faced in earlier years, but rather worn-down formations, often labelled as second-rate. The 353rd Infantry Division, later the 275th, and other units that would be rotated in as the battle dragged on. Their strength was below theoretical establishment and mixed veterans from the Eastern Front, young recruits and reorganized remnants of units destroyed in France. The 9th Infantry Division, from triumph in France to the gates of the Reich. The 9th Infantry Division arrived at the Hürtgen Forest carrying a burden few units could match: nearly 2 years of continuous combat. Its men had learned to fight in the deserts of Tunisia, had climbed the dusty hills of Sicily, and later had forced their way through the hedgerows of Normandy. Its artillery had helped stop Rommel after Kasserine. In France, it had been on the front line during the siege of Cherbourg, and later in the breakout from the beachheads. It was not a poster division, it had no flashy nickname or a histrionic general courting headlines, but correspondents who knew it regarded it simply as one of our best infantry divisions. In early September 1944, the advanced units of the First Army were already crossing the border rivers. American patrols set foot on German soil with almost no opposition, finding empty bunkers, dust accumulated on the floors, and even chicken coops built around some casemates. It seemed that the famous West Wall was nothing more than a hollow facade. That almost peaceful entry into Germany fed a dangerous illusion, the idea that the enemy was broken and that the war, in essence, was already won. For the 9th Division, that moment of euphoria was brief. After the first wave of crossings, the division received the mission of holding and expanding the bridgehead in the sector south of Aachen, right where the wooded hills of the Eifel began. Its 3 regiments deployed along a front that combined open fields, small villages, and the first fingers of the Hürtgen Forest. There, the war ceased to look like a mobile campaign and once again became a slow, close-quarters struggle around every stream, every hill, and every clearing among the trees. The 60th Regiment, a battle-hardened veteran since North Africa, played a central role in that initial advance into the Reich. Its men, whom commanders called the Go Devils, had learned to move through difficult terrain, to improvise routes among hedgerows and ruins. Now they had to do so against an enemy who, after the chaotic retreat through France, was beginning to regroup behind the fortifications of the West Wall. American engineers opened gaps in minefields. Patrols slipped among the bunkers, probing German reactions. Artillery, when ammunition was available, pounded suspected lines. Among the objectives assigned to the 9th in that phase was a small village of sloping roofs and narrow streets, Schevenhütte. On the map, it was little more than a dot on a secondary road. In reality, it controlled a series of heights and forest tracks leading eastward toward Stolberg and the northern edge of the Hürtgen Forest. Taking it meant driving a first wedge into the German defensive system beyond the border positions. The attack was planned as a limited operation, but for the men in the first wave there was nothing limited about the risk they faced. They advanced under intermittent rain, mud clinging to boots and equipment, crossing meadows saturated with mines and barbed wire. Artillery observers tried to locate enemy guns firing from the wooded slopes. Often, when they managed to silence them, other batteries farther back opened up. German machine guns, well concealed in houses on the edge of the village or in positions dug among the trees, swept the approaches to Schevenhütte. Companies of the 60th and elements of the 39th fought their way forward house by house, trench by trench. Explosions sent cascades of tiles and beams into the air. Walls collapsed onto the soldiers, who used the rubble itself as cover to advance a few more meters. At more than one crossroads, platoons had to crawl literally under fire, searching for dead ground in enemy observation. Medics worked at the limit, dragging wounded men out of minefields or entering half-collapsed buildings to extract those who had been trapped. When the Americans finally secured the center of the village, they discovered that success carried an ambiguous price. Schevenhütte was in their hands, but the ground around it was still dominated by heights held by the Germans. Even so, the order was clear. The position had to be held. The 9th Division quickly organized the defense of Schevenhütte, using cellars as command and aid posts, reinforcing walls with sandbags and logs, adapting barns into machine gun nests. At night, engineers opened new trenches and passages between houses so that squads could move without exposing themselves in the streets. By day, German artillery pounded the village. The men learned to tell by the sound whether the next shell would land near or far, whether they should hit the ground or keep running. The Schevenhütte salient had an immediate effect on the morale of both sides. For the Americans, it was proof that they could pierce the West Wall and hold on inside Germany despite the resistance. For the Germans, it became a humiliating reminder that the enemy had not only crossed the border, but was now occupying villages and heights that, until recently, had been considered an untouchable part of the Reich's sacred soil. The advance toward Schmidt, Hürtgen and Kleinhau. From Schevenhütte, the 9th Division looked eastward and saw on the maps an apparently logical route: cross the Hürtgen Forest, seize the high ground between the village of the same name and Kleinhau, and from there open the door toward Schmidt and the Roer Plain. On paper, it was a flanking movement to protect the main advance toward Aachen. On the ground, it was the beginning of a dead end. The immediate objective was the network of roads linking Schevenhütte with Hürtgen and farther on with Kleinhau. That layout, which on a map appeared as a simple connection of villages, in reality became a series of narrow gorges where infantry had to advance on foot, with tanks from the 3rd Armoured or small attached armoured detachments barely nosing forward along dirt tracks. The damp wood absorbed sound. The men felt that every step drew them deeper into a kind of green pit. By late September, the regiments of the 9th were relieving one another along the line. They advanced 100–200 metres, organised a new foothold, and lost it after nightfall when a German counterattack, supported by mortars and accurate artillery, forced them back. In many sectors of the front there was no clear line, only isolated platoon-sized groups trying to orient themselves with compasses that became useless among identical trees. The Germans, few in number but well entrenched, exploited the advantages of the terrain to the fullest. Small infantry detachments, veterans from Russia or Italy, occupied camouflaged concrete bunkers, sniper holes among roots and machine gun positions embedded in the slopes. Fire almost always came from above, from the ridges dominating the road toward Hürtgen, from the edges of the plateau that led farther on to Kleinhau. The Americans rarely saw the enemy. Instead, they saw the effects of shells exploding in the treetops and turning splinters into wooden blades. With October came continuous rain. The forest, already gloomy, became almost claustrophobic. Improvised trenches filled with icy water, ponchos were not enough, and the ground turned into thick mud. Some attempts to push deeper toward Hürtgen ended in almost instantaneous tragedy. Companies that broke out of the woods into a clearing were met by interlocking machine gun fire and artillery observers who had spent days registering that empty space. Later reports would speak of platoons that within minutes were reduced to a handful of men crawling back into the shadows of the trees. The myth of rapid advance, of the war of maneuver that had characterized the campaign in France, collapsed among roots and shattered trunks. German artillery became the true master of the forest. With observers positioned along the edges of the Hürtgen Plateau and in the vicinity of Kleinhau, they could direct precise fire onto any trail the Americans dared to use. Lacking open skies, Allied aviation could scarcely intervene. Fighter bombers, so effective over the French countryside, were almost useless beneath a closed canopy of treetops. Amid that lethal routine, the name Schmidt began to appear more and more frequently in orders. Although the village of Hürtgen itself and the ridge linking it to Kleinhau still lay ahead, planners were already looking beyond, toward the wooded upland where Schmidt stood, dominating the valleys leading to the Rur dams. For the soldiers, Schmidt was no more than a point on the map, but it was beginning to become the promise of a defined objective that might give meaning to so much sacrifice. The capture of Schmidt, the factory of death, and the disintegration of the 112th Regiment, November. November 2nd, 1944, dawned dirty, cold and grey over the Hürtgen Forest. Old snow crunched underfoot, and beneath that frozen crust lay the bodies of men from the 9th Division that no one had had time to recover. For the soldiers of the Pennsylvania-based 28th Division, arriving as replacements, the landscape was a warning of what awaited them. The new objective was clear and ambitious: cross the Karl Valley, capture Schmidt, and cling to the plateau, sealing the southern door to the Reich. At precisely 8 o'clock, the forest's silence was shattered by a roar reminiscent of 1918. 12,000 shells fell on German positions, a massive artillery bombardment that threw up columns of earth, pine splinters, and twisted steel. After the preparatory fire, the 2nd Battalion of the 112th Regiment advanced from Görmete and succeeded in taking Vossenack, where it began digging in hastily under the gaze of German observers positioned on the heights of Brandenburg, Bergstein, Kommerscheid, and Schmidt. The road to the main objective seemed open. Meanwhile, the 3rd Battalion of the 112th prepared for the most difficult part of the plan, crossing the deep gorge of the Col along a narrow, steep forest path scarcely worthy of being called a road. Men, mules, jeeps, half-tracks, and anti-tank guns all had to pass that way. Very quickly, the Col trail turned into a trap. Vehicles sliding into the ravine, tracks spinning uselessly in the mud, stretchers lined up along the verge awaiting evacuation. Every metre gained cost time and lives, but the plan remained unchanged. Take Schmidt, hold it, and turn it into a bridgehead toward the Rur dams, although most regimental officers had barely even heard of those dams. In the early hours of November 3rd, the leading elements of the 3rd Battalion managed to push through to Kommerscheid and beyond, toward Schmidt. The Germans, surprised by the axis of advance, offered only scattered resistance. Schmidt was not a large town, merely a village of low roofs and narrow streets, but it dominated the southeastern ridge and controlled the access roads. To American commanders, it was the key to the plateau. When the men of the 112th finally entered the village, amid damaged houses and downed poles, the initial feeling was one of victory. For the first time since September, Americans were firmly east of the Karl. But the success was fragile. Heavy artillery had been left behind in the rear area. The guns and tanks attempting to cross the Karl Gorge became bogged down or were easy targets for German observation. In Schmidt, the 3rd Battalion found itself virtually isolated, with few anti-tank weapons, limited ammunition, and intermittent communications. The men were exhausted after days of marching and fighting among splintered trees. The position looked like a triumph, but in reality it was a vulnerable salient thrust too deeply into the enemy's defences. At dawn the next day, the illusion ended. First came the howitzers. The Germans began to walk their fire across the entire village, from the outskirts to the centre, destroying positions one by one, collapsing roofs, turning basements into death traps. Beneath that curtain of fire came a sound many recognized with terror, the metallic screech of tracks and the deep rumble of armoured engines approaching. The counterattack everyone feared had begun. A dozen tanks, mostly Panzer IVs, and around 150 infantrymen emerged from the fog, advancing with unsettling confidence. Lieutenant Colonel Flood, commanding the 3rd Battalion, called for artillery support, but the batteries were poorly coordinated, under fire, or without clear communications. Friendly fire never came. Engineers had laid mines, but many tanks rolled over them without detonating or without suffering decisive damage. Infantry bazookas struck the armour without penetrating it, rounds bouncing like incandescent balls off steel plates. In Company K, the sight of the approaching tanks shattered many men's nerves. An entire platoon began to fall back without orders. Flood and his officers tried to stop the tide of men dissolving among ruined houses and shattered gardens, but panic proved stronger than discipline. Some even abandoned wounded comrades who pleaded from roadside ditches. Others, disoriented, fled into the forest and fell into the hands of German patrols, slowly closing the ring around the village. From the regimental command post, Colonel Carl L. Peterson relayed ever-worsening news to the division. He had spent decades with the 112th and knew many of his men by name. Now he watched the entire formation come apart before him. General Norman Cotter at the 28th Division headquarters received confused messages. Was it a single company pulling back, or the whole battalion? He sent an officer, Colonel Lockett, to assess the situation in Schmidt. Lockett never arrived. His jeep was ambushed, and he ended up a prisoner. Within hours, the chain of command was riddled with gaps, officers captured or isolated on the far side of the Karl. Men fleeing from Schmidt began arriving at Kommerscheid with vacant stares and uniforms caked in mud and blood. Officers and NCOs tried to stop them with blows, shouts, even by pointing service pistols at them. They managed to hold only about 200. The rest scattered into the forest, searching for any place that was not that exposed village. News of the collapse at Schmidt spread like wildfire. If the vanguard had disintegrated, what chance did those still defending the Karl crossing have? Behind the front, the medical regimental station set up at the honeymoon post received a constant flood of wounded. Stretcher-bearers marked morphine doses on foreheads, cut away blood-soaked clothing, and sorted men into operable and no hope. Behind the improvised operating room, a growing pile of amputated limbs formed, the air filled with the smell of disinfectant, gunpowder, and burned flesh. For those who entered that place, the phrase "factory of death" was no longer a journalistic metaphor, but a literal description of what the forest was doing to every regiment that ventured inside. Cotter, under pressure from Corps' headquarters, and the insistence that Schmidt must be held at all costs, ordered the attack force reconstituted. A task force was assembled, combining remnants of infantry and engineers with supporting armour. On paper it was to force its way along the Karl, reinforce Kommerscheid and retake Schmidt. In practice, the Karl Trail had become a corridor of death, swept from every angle by artillery and snipers. Tanks that ventured forward were destroyed or abandoned at the most exposed bends. Mules and half-tracks piled up into an immobile convoy, leaving wounded men trapped on stretchers under rain and fire. When a general withdrawal west of the Col was finally authorized, the 112th was no longer an operational regiment in any meaningful sense. Peterson himself, wounded twice and overwhelmed by the scale of the disaster, had to crawl, literally, along the Col Trail to report firsthand on the condition of his unit. Years later, veterans who returned to that valley as tourists recalled the image of the colonel beside himself, moving on all fours among overturned vehicles and bodies covered with blankets. The toll was devastating. In the 112th Regiment of roughly 3,000 men who had entered combat barely 2 weeks earlier, more than 2,000 became casualties, hundreds captured or missing, others killed, wounded, or incapacitated by non-combat causes such as extreme exhaustion and trench foot. For the 28th Division as a whole, losses exceeded 6,000 men, nearly half its original strength. In the rifle companies, losses reached or effectively exceeded 100%. Entire platoons vanished from the rolls, later replaced by recruits who had never seen the forest. Operation Queen, the Great Offensive and the Small Hell of Hürtgen. In early November 1944, while the remnants of the 112th Regiment were dragging themselves out of the Kahl Valley, Allied planners were thinking about something far larger than a lost forest on the German-Belgian border. For Eisenhower, Bradley and Hodges, the Western Front required a massive offensive that would finally break through the Siegfried Line, reach the Rur River, and open the road to the Rhine. That plan, christened Operation Queen, was to mobilize hundreds of thousands of soldiers, enormous concentrations of artillery, and the strategic air forces. On the surface, the Hürtgen Forest was just another corner of that chessboard. In practice, it would become one of the friction points that shaped the entire design. The general concept was simple. 2 U.S. armies, the 1st under Hodges to the south and the 9th under Simpson to the north, would advance in parallel toward the Rur. Once the western bank was reached, crossings would be prepared, and after securing a bridgehead, the next natural objective would be the Rhine. Overlaid on this ground scheme was a colossal air component. On November 16th, thousands of heavy and medium bombers would devastate the cities and rail hubs between Düren, Jülich, and Eschweiler, seeking to paralyze German mobility before the infantry moved forward. But there was an uncomfortable detail on the map. The Rur was not a normal river. In its upper course, to the south and east of the Hürtgen Forest, a series of dams held millions of cubic meters of water. Several engineers from the 19th Corps had already warned in writing that if the Germans opened the sluices or demolished the dams, they could flood the valley, turning it into a lake more than a kilometer wide, rendering any crossing attempt useless for weeks and forcing the Allies to funnel all their vehicles along a few elevated roads. Thus, the role Hürtgen would play within Operation Queen was defined indirectly. The main effort of the First Army would fall on Lightning Joe Collins's 7th Corps, which was to advance north of Aachen across more open ground, supported by armour and tactical aviation. V Corps, covering the forest sector, was given an apparently secondary task: protect the right flank of the advance, clear the wooded heights from which German artillery could observe and strike the supply routes toward the Rur, and, if possible, keep pushing forward to approach the dams. That, if possible, would become a trap. For Simpson's 9th Army to launch its own phase of the offensive and later cross the Rur, it was essential that the enemy not be able to control the river's flow at will. In practical terms, that meant neutralizing the reservoirs, or at least preventing the Germans from using them as a weapon. The only land route to those dams ran across the Schmidt Plateau and the surrounding villages, and the only reasonable access to that plateau from Hodges's sector went through the Hürtgen Forest. The defeat of the 28th Division at Schmidt did not substantially alter the logic of the plan. Official language continued to speak of the need to secure the right wing and dominate the wooded salients, formulations that masked a simple reality. An infantry division had been committed to terrain that offered no tactical advantages to American material superiority. Even so, when Operation Queen was designed, no one seriously proposed abandoning the forest, sealing it off from the air and its periphery, and seeking alternative routes to the dams. The prestige of the chain of command and the logic of no retreat weighed more heavily than a cold analysis of the ground. On the German side, the forest and the dams were part of a single defensive system. Model's Army Group B knew it could not stop the Allies indefinitely in open terrain, but it could buy time by forcing American infantry to fight in spaces where tanks and aviation were nearly useless. Volksgrenadier divisions, reinforced with remnants of units exhausted in Russia and France, dug in along the ridges, covering the approaches to Schmidt and watching the Rur Valley. From their perspective, every day the river crossing was delayed was another day to reorganize reserves, strengthen the Siegfried Line, and prepare the counter-offensive Hitler was planning in the Ardennes. On November 16th, when the first waves of heavy bombers filled the horizon over Düren and Jülich with smoke and dust, the Hürtgen Forest barely noticed the difference. The pine canopy hid the spectacle. In the distance, the dull thunder of bombs could be heard, and columns of black smoke rose over the plain. But beneath the treetops, the war remained the same. German artillery sweeping the roads, mines hidden in the mud, patrols getting lost amid fog and splintered wood. While Operation Queen moved forward in open country, V Corps prepared once again to launch an infantry attack into the Green Labyrinth. First advance of 7th Corps. The advance of 7th Corps had become Hodges's great gamble to break through toward the Rhine. The disaster suffered by the 9th and 28th Divisions inside the forest forced a change of approach. Now the main pressure had to come from the north, with veteran and better-equipped divisions, while the 4th remained clinging to Hürtgen to protect the flank. From November 16th onward, when the general offensive began, responsibility for the advance rested on 4 different pieces of the same mechanism: the 1st Infantry Division, the 4th Infantry Division, the 104th Timberwolves Infantry Division, and the Combat Command Reserve, CCR, of the 5th Armoured Division. The Big Red One opened the way in Collins's central sector. It was a tough unit, veteran of Africa and Normandy, accustomed to dismantling German defences village by village. Facing it now, however, was no longer the French bocage, but an awkward mix of industrial hamlets, wooded hills, and the first folds of the plateau leading toward the Rur River. German positions around Eschweiler, Langewehr, and the villages on the edge of the plain were reinforced with west wall bunkers, minefields, and well-served artillery firing from wooded elevations. On November 16th, after an air and artillery bombardment that promised more than it actually destroyed, the regiments of the 1st advanced across ground turned into a mixture of mud, rubble, and craters. Reports spoke of progress measured in houses and courtyards, not in kilometres. Every street taken meant clearing basements, reducing machine gun nests in concrete buildings, and enduring counter-battery fire coming from within the Hürtgen. Contact with the forest was constant. Even while fighting in villages and along roads, the men of the Big Red One felt to their right the dark shadow of the woods from which shells burst in the treetops and showered down as lethal splinters. Farther north, the 104th Infantry Division, the Timberwolves under Terry Allen, was entering its first major test on the German front. Allen was no stranger to the 1st Division. He had once commanded many of the men now fighting under Hübner, and he brought to 7th Corps a formation blooded in Holland and famed for its night attacks. In November, his sector stretched across the industrial belt north of Aachen, an area of factories, mines, and rail lines that the Germans defended tenaciously. The fighting on the 104th's front unfolded in coal yards, along railroad tracks, and among brick buildings collapsing under direct fire from tanks and assault guns. There, combat bore the same brutal face as in the forest. A short soldier with pale grey eyes arrived at an aid station with his forearm hanging by a few tendons. Sitting almost calmly, he asked the surgeon to finish cutting off what no longer worked. The medics hid the severed hand under a blanket so others would not see it. It was just one example of how the 7th Corps advance, even far from the thick woods, was paid for in flesh and bone. South of that urban industrial axis, the 4th Infantry Division remained trapped in another war altogether, that of Hürtgen itself. While the 1st and the 104th pushed toward the Rur across more open ground, the regiments of the 4th were tasked with the thankless mission of holding the right flank of 7th Corps anchored in the forest, advancing through the villages of Hürtgen, Kleinhau, and farther on, Grosshau. Their objectives looked less impressive on maps: a forest clearing, a woodland road, an unnamed elevation. Yet control of these points was essential to prevent the Germans from striking the Big Red One or the Timberwolves from the flank. Around November 21st, the pressure on the 4th was so intense that Corps headquarters had to inject fresh forces into the factory of death. The 8th Division arrived, and its 121st Regiment marched at night through rain and mud to position itself behind the 4th's 12th Regiment and relieve it on the front line. The men debarked from their trucks in darkness and walked for miles through icy puddles to their assembly areas with scarcely any time to reconnoitre the terrain. At dawn, they were ordered to attack almost blindly. The instruction was simple and terrible. The enemy lay ahead, and the only option was to advance. The CCR of the 5th Armoured Division was Collins's other card within 7th Corps. Officially, it was a mobile force intended to exploit a breakthrough, but in practice it spent November acting as a plug wherever the infantry was bleeding out. When a regiment was reduced by half, tanks from the 5th moved up to the forest edges or across waterlogged fields, firing on pockets of resistance and pillboxes to allow a few platoons to advance a few hundred meters. The roads and trails around Gay, Strasse, and the heights overlooking Hürtgen were so narrow that Sherman tanks often became wedged in place, turning themselves into stationary targets for German artillery. Even so, the presence of the CCR proved decisive at several moments during the month. Where the 4th Division ran out of men, a company of tanks or tank destroyers was thrown forward to shore up wavering lines or support a local counterattack. At other times, the CCR waited a few kilometers behind the 1st and the 104th, ready to surge through a breach and turn toward the interior if German resistance collapsed. That collapse never came. Every village seized by 7th Corps seemed to be replaced by another knot of resistance farther east, always anchored in woods and in the depth defense of the Rur line. By late November, the map showed progress. The big red one had pushed the German line beyond several key villages, the 104th had consolidated the industrial zone to the north, and the reinforced 4th clung to the clearings captured in Hürtgen. But behind those lines on paper lay an attrition that was becoming unbearable. Some rifle companies were down to half their original strength. Replacements arrived straight from the United States with no combat experience and fell during their first days in the forest or among the ruins. German counterattack and bombardment. When the advance of 7th Corps seemed at last to have opened a breach east of the forest, the German command responded with the only resource it still possessed to level the balance: concentrated fire. In late November, as American divisions reorganized their lines around Grossau, Gay, and the clearings gained at enormous cost, German observers were adjusting their firing maps from the ridges overlooking the forest. It was the hour of the artillery. The forest magnified the violence of every impact. Shells did not explode on the ground but in the pine canopies, multiplying the shrapnel into a horizontal rain of splinters and steel. Men learned to fear trees as much as shells. A nearby trunk could become a gigantic grenade. The first salvos fell on the forward command posts of the 4th Infantry Division, where officers were trying to reorganize their decimated regiments after the fighting for Grossau. Radios smashed, telephone lines cut, and messengers cut down on the roads turned every order into a broken chain. The main effect of the bombardment was not the destruction of positions, but the disarticulation of command. As they fell back into small pockets of resistance among the trees, American companies discovered that German fire followed their movements with precision. The enemy had learned to read patterns of advance. Every time a clearing was opened to emplace mortars, every time bulldozers tried to widen a road, artillery observers, hidden in ruined farmhouses or camouflaged bunkers, passed along the coordinates. The Nebelwerfers, with their unmistakable howling sound, added a devastating psychological element. Soldiers spoke of devil's organs, rockets that not only killed but announced death with a prolonged, impossible-to-ignore scream. Behind the fire barrages came the counterattacks. These were not large, massed offensives, but precise blows against isolated units that had advanced too far. In early December, small groups of German grenadiers and paratroopers began infiltrating between the lines of the 1st Infantry Division, seeking the seams between battalions. Under cover of fog and the smoke from burning trees, they closed to grenade range, fired short bursts from machine guns, and disappeared before American artillery could react. The forest, with its limited visibility and tangle of trunks, was the ideal setting for such incursions. On the outskirts of Gay, companies of the 104th Infantry Division found that every hamlet captured immediately became a priority target. Stone houses that seemed like solid shelters collapsed after minutes of shelling, and basements filled with smoke and dust until the air became unbreathable. Engineers tried to improvise shelters in the damp earth, but high water tables flooded the holes. Sleeping dry was a rare luxury. In that environment, German counterattacks did not require large numbers. A determined platoon, supported by a couple of assault guns or an isolated panzer, was enough to force an exhausted company to fall back a few hundred meters. Farther north, around Kleinhau and Grosshau, the remnants of German divisions that had held out since September were reinforced by fresh units transferred from other sectors. German command understood that the forest was the last protective curtain before the plains leading to the Ruhr. The order was clear: halt 7th Corps at any cost, grinding down its offensive until it no longer had the strength to continue. Field artillery, heavy howitzers and large-caliber mortars were concentrated along a narrow front. Every American attempt to open a new breach was followed by an immediate surge of fire, as if the forest itself responded with a roar. American logistics became another target. The roads climbing from rear areas toward the ruined villages were narrow, muddy, and easily located. Ammunition trucks, ambulances, and command jeeps were knocked out one after another by German artillery. Drivers learned to accelerate through certain stretches where, almost punctually, shells began to fall. A delay of seconds could mean being caught in an artillery ambush. The evacuation of wounded, already difficult because of the terrain, became nearly impossible when return routes were swept by enemy fire for hours at a time. The American response was to multiply their own fires as well. 7th Corps artillery batteries worked almost without rest, firing at coordinates that often no longer corresponded to German positions as the enemy constantly shifted emplacements. The artillery duel, however, favored the defender. German observers, well positioned along the forest edges and on heights controlling roads and clearings, could see more and better. The Americans, buried in the undergrowth, could barely make out shadows among the trunks. The result was constant attrition, an erosion of men, material, and morale that made each day's resumption of the offensive more difficult. In this context of crossed fire occurred one of the most symbolic episodes of the period: the fight for the dominant heights east of the forest, hills that visually controlled both villages and approach routes. To seize them, elite units such as the Rangers were committed, advancing up muddy slopes under a storm of grenades and mortars. Every metre gained required clearing trenches, machine gun nests, and shelters dug into the rock. When they finally reached the crest, they found that the position was immediately isolated by a new ring of German fire. Holding the summit proved almost as costly as taking it. The weather completed the picture of disaster. Freezing rain, thick fog, and the first snowstorms turned the forest into a trap of mud and ice. Men spent entire days soaked through, their feet swollen inside their boots as medics warned of an alarming rise in trench foot cases. German bombardment exploited these conditions. When the fog closed in, frontline troops could not see the source of the flashes, only hear the rising whistle of shells until the moment of impact. The sense of helplessness increased nervous strain. Many soldiers shook constantly, even when it was not cold. Meanwhile, on the German side, orders were clear: hold. The command of the 7th Army saw Hürtgen as a place where the enemy was willing to bleed by its own decision. Every day, 7th Corps remained trapped in the tangle of trees and craters was another day to reorganize reserves in the rear, another day to prepare operations in other sectors of the front. Whether consciously or not, German artillery continued pounding the forest with relentless discipline, turning enemy-held clearings into improvised cemeteries. By December, the picture was that of a front that did not advance, yet continued to consume men and ammunition at an unbearable rate. The Americans held positions that offered no decisive advantage, subjected to daily punishment that steadily eroded their ability to respond. The Battle of Kesternich and the annihilation of the 309th Battalion. In mid-December 1944, the 78th Infantry Division, newly arrived from the United States and still green, entered combat for the first time on the Hürtgen front. After 2.5 years of training, its baptism of fire would not come in a quiet sector, but against one of the toughest objectives of the entire campaign: the plateau leading to Schmidt and, at the center of that position, the small village of Kesternich. On the surface it was little more than a cluster of stone houses and narrow streets, but it dominated the routes toward the Rur Reservoir and dams. If Kesternich fell, the road to Schmidt would be open. If it held, V Corps' advance would remain stuck in the same old trap. Within the 78th, the 309th Regiment was assigned one of the most delicate missions. Its battalions were to advance from the line of departure through deep snow, cross minefields and lines of pillboxes, and seize first the German barracks and forward positions, and then Kesternich itself. The division already arrived burdened by structural problems. It had been stripped of veterans to reinforce other units and filled with very young replacements, led by officers with little or no real combat experience. On paper, it was a trained division. In practice, it was a largely inexperienced formation thrown without transition into the worst corner of the front. The attack began in the early hours of December 13th in bitter cold, low fog, and a heavy silence broken only by the distant rumble of artillery. Learning from the lessons of the divisions that had shattered before them, the 78th's commanders decided to forgo a massive preliminary bombardment. They wanted to surprise the defenders, not alert them. The men of the 309th advanced in single file, slipping down icy slopes, crossing white fields where every mound of snow might conceal a mine. The first explosion came when a soldier stepped on a charge. The brief flash lit up tense helmets and very young faces. The instinct was to stop. Sergeants, shouting, drove them forward. Despite the initial casualties, the advance managed to slip past several German positions. In the half-light, patrols of the 309th bypassed pillboxes, captured listening posts, and at dawn burst into a set of barracks where they caught the defenders at breakfast. It was a moment of euphoria. For once it seemed that the plan was working, that infantry could force its way forward without being slaughtered in the open. From the rear, regimental headquarters reported that the intermediate objective was in their hands and requested permission to continue the advance. There began the chain of decisions that would end with the battalion's annihilation. The original plan called for the 309th to halt at the barracks, consolidate the position and allow the 310th to pass through toward Schmidt. However, pressure to exploit success and the obsession with the Rur dams weighed more heavily. Corps headquarters insisted the 309th was to push on as far as it could, even without tank support or heavy weapons, which could not reach the area while the roads remained blocked. Once again, the infantry was to do the job alone. The 2nd Battalion of the 309th received orders to continue toward Kesternich. Its companies crossed the snow exhausted, boots soaked, frozen socks clinging to their skin. There was no time to carefully reconnoiter the terrain or open alternate routes. The paths were covered by artillery fire and flanked by houses the Germans had reinforced as small bunkers. Even so, at the cost of house-to-house fighting, grenades thrown through windows, bursts of M1 fire on narrow staircases, the American soldiers bit off pieces of the village. By nightfall, Kesternich was officially reported as in American hands. In reality, the 2nd Battalion was stretched thin and poorly connected, holding a few central blocks while the Germans retained strong positions on the outskirts and in the basements of several houses. Radio communications failed amid snow, smoke and thick walls. Field telephone lines were cut again and again by shell fire. Most critically, the roads to the rear remained under enemy observation, preventing tanks, accompanying artillery and reinforcements from arriving in time. The battalion slept in a surrounded village with limited ammunition and an enemy that knew every corner better than they did. In the darkness before dawn, an American forward artillery observer detected movement east of Kesternich, shadows gathering, the sound of engines, figures deploying across the snow. He recognized the signs of a counterattack and called in the coordinates by telephone. Minutes later, divisional artillery unleashed a massive bombardment on the German formations. For a moment it seemed the danger had passed. The attack dispersed, the cries of wounded enemy soldiers mingled with the roar of the guns, and the men of the 2nd Battalion breathed a little easier. But that had only been the advance guard. By mid-morning, the main counterattack went in, this time coordinated and supported by assault guns and armoured elements of the 10th Panzer Division. From the slopes and the village entrances, tanks began shelling the houses sheltering the Americans, blasting holes in facades and collapsing roofs onto basements filled with wounded men. German infantry, veteran and hardened by years of war, slid forward behind the fire, house by house, using every wall, every fence, every frozen drainage ditch to close in without exposing themselves unnecessarily. Inside Kesternich, the defence of the 2nd Battalion fractured into small, isolated pockets. One squad held out in a barn until it ran out of ammunition. Another was buried when a cannon round blew out a wall. The companies had lost many of their officers in the first hours, and sergeants improvised lines of resistance in kitchens, stables, or corridors choked with rubble. The Germans advanced using grenade launchers and shaped charges against the walls, blasting openings that allowed them to move from one house to the next without exposing themselves in the streets. The pressure increased when the panzers managed to position themselves on the flanks of the village and began firing straight down the streets, sweeping away any attempt at movement. Under this crossfire, the 2nd Battalion's ammunition reserves began to run dry. Attempts to send ammunition forward from the rear were smashed by enemy artillery, which relentlessly covered the access routes. Some messengers simply vanished in the snow, others arrived half frozen, having managed to advance only a few hundred meters. By midday, parts of the battalion had been reduced to exchanging grenades and sporadic shots. Others simply fell silent, suppressed, or destroyed. The commander of the 2nd Battalion watched his perimeter shrink block by block, saw the Germans overflow positions he could no longer cover. There was no reliable radio, no supporting artillery that could fire without annihilating their own men, no tanks. What remained were scattered soldiers, wounded men piled up in basements, and a handful of officers trying to hold the impossible. When German tanks and infantry broke into the last pocket of resistance around the improvised command post, the situation was untenable. Most machine guns were out of action, ammunition was nearly exhausted, and there was no longer a continuous line to defend. The battalion commander, surrounded by the survivors, made the decision no officer ever wanted to make, to surrender in order to avoid a pointless massacre. He and what remained of his companies were taken prisoner and marched toward the German rear through a village burning on all sides. Kesternich fell back into enemy hands. The 2nd Battalion of the 309th had ceased to exist as a fighting unit. Of the entire battalion, only a handful of men survived, centered around a captain and little more than 50 soldiers who would be counted as prisoners. The rest lay dead among the ruins, were scattered as wounded in the snow, or had been captured in small groups as their positions collapsed. In practical terms, the battalion had been annihilated. Outside the village, command attempted an immediate response. Remnants of the 3rd Battalion of the 309th and an improvised force from the 310th, drivers without vehicles, cooks, clerks, and heavy weapons personnel hastily turned into riflemen, were rushed forward toward Kesternich. They entered the edges of the village, hugged walls and fences, and managed to retake a few houses in close quarters fighting. But the enemy, supported by armor and firmly holding the central positions, drove them back again with heavy losses. The counterattack failed to restore the situation. It only added more names to the casualty list. By nightfall, Kesternich was still burning under the snow in German hands. The 78th Division's attempt to force its way toward Schmidt had come to an abrupt halt. In just a few hours, an entire battalion of the 309th had been destroyed. The division, barely beginning its history on the European front, already carried a deep and lasting wound. December, American defeat and the shift of attention to the Ardennes. The final weeks of the year found the 78th Infantry Division struggling to consolidate its foothold around Kesternich, the key to any advance toward Schmidt and the dam system. The village, reduced to a heap of stone shells, had changed hands in brutal house-to-house fighting. The companies holding it were shadows of themselves, mixes of exhausted veterans and replacements who barely knew their commanders' names. The ground was frozen, corpses lay half-buried under snow, and the roads were so shattered that supplies arrived late, or not at all. In the early hours of one of those last Saturdays of December, a forward observer from the 903rd Artillery Battalion spotted dark movement in the gloom. He reported a possible counterattack by telephone and gave approximate coordinates. Within minutes, the division's gunners prepared a massive fire mission, several battalions firing 5 salvos almost simultaneously. The entire forest seemed to lift off the ground as the barrage crashed down on German troops groping forward through the snow. For a moment it seemed the deluge of shells would be enough to stop everything. Shouts, fleeing silhouettes, the ground strewn with motionless bodies. But it was only the prelude. By mid-morning, the German attack was unleashed in full force. Supported by self-propelled guns, the 10th Panzer Division, once commanded by Rommel, burst into the thinned-out positions of the 78th. It drove straight at Kesternich, sweeping trenches, reducing machine gun nests, and enveloping the houses still standing. The commander of the 2nd Battalion, 309th Regiment, with what remained of his men, ultimately surrendered. He was taken prisoner along with the garrison that had continued to resist. When the firing ceased, Kesternich was once again in German hands, and the battalion had virtually ceased to exist. American command reacted with the reflexes that had become habitual in Hürtgen, improvising more infantry from wherever it could be found. The 3rd Battalion of the 309th and a task force formed from companies of the 310th were hurled into a desperate counterattack. Not just riflemen, drivers who had lost their vehicles, cooks, clerks, heavy weapons specialists hastily turned into infantrymen. Anyone capable of holding an M1 rifle was sent toward the ruined village. They managed to enter Kesternich through snow and smoke, crossing streets turned into trenches of rubble, but German numerical and fire superiority swept them out again. The counterattack dissolved into small groups retreating or trapped in basements and barns. For many, Kesternich was the last name they would hear in this war. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the forest, the story repeated itself with only minor variations. Units that had held on in November, remnants of the 4th Division, elements of the 8th and the 1st, remained pinned to their sectors, subjected to constant attrition. Cases of trench foot, pneumonia and frostbite piled up at aid stations. Veteran cadres, the glue that held companies together, had been decimated. In some cases, casualty rates reached or exceeded 100%. Regiments that entered with full strength and weeks later had to be rebuilt entirely with replacements newly arrived from the United States. In late November, the Wehrmacht's chief meteorologist Karl Recknagel predicted that from December 16th onward there would be a period of fog, rain and snowfall over the Eifel and the Ardennes. The Führer's weather, ideal for concealing an offensive and neutralizing Allied air superiority. With that report in hand, Hitler finally set the date for his great counter-offensive, the early morning of December 16, 1944. What remained, for the men in the forest, a senseless battle of attrition, was now being folded into a much larger strategic gamble. The impact was soon felt. That morning, while a special meal was being prepared in the rear to celebrate Eisenhower's appointment as a 5-star general, artillery observers began reporting massive movements and concentrations of fire in sectors that had previously been relatively quiet. The German attack spread like wildfire across the Ardennes front, catching exhausted divisions, resting units, and unprepared logistical hubs by surprise. For the men in Hürtgen, the first impression was that it was just another local counterattack, stronger than usual, but nothing unprecedented. Only when reports stated that the Germans were advancing westward, deep into Belgium, did it become clear that something far larger was unfolding. The paradox was brutal. At the very moment when troops in Hürtgen were still being ambushed, stepping on mines or dying beneath splintered trees, media and political attention shifted decisively away from the forest. The German offensive in the Ardennes seized the headlines, the concern of commanders, and later collective memory. Hürtgen, by contrast, faded from communiques under vague formulas such as limited activity or local fighting, even though the bloodletting continued. When the long struggle in the forest finally ended in early 1945, the reckoning was devastating. Over 6 months, 8 U.S. infantry divisions and 2 armored divisions, along with several smaller units, had been committed to that sector. Many rifle companies had suffered losses of up to 50% in barely 2 weeks. 2 regiments, the 60th of the 9th Division and the 22nd of the 4th, were literally destroyed twice. In the end, nearly 30,000 American soldiers were killed or wounded in Hürtgen, not counting the thousands evacuated for combat exhaustion or illnesses linked to the extreme conditions. The price paid for that stretch of forest, barely 50 square miles, was grossly disproportionate to the results achieved. By the time High Command fully grasped that capturing the Rur dams was the only truly important strategic objective, it was too late. The installations remained in German hands, ready to be used as a hydrographic weapon if the Allies attempted to cross the river. Operations to seize them would have to wait until February, and the delay would add more names to the casualty lists of British and Canadian units on the Rur front. For the veterans who emerged alive from the forest, however, official figures could never convey what that place had meant. By Christmas 1944, while the world watched in horror the German advance in the Ardennes, the Battle of the Hürtgen Forest was already lost, militarily because of the absurd cost for such meagre gains, morally because of the chasm it opened between the soldiers who fought it and the commanders who refused to admit that it should never have been fought at all.